Snow howled across the empty plains like a living creature. The blizzard had come without warning, swallowing everything in a sea of white. Miles of flat land vanished under a shroud of ice and roaring wind. The old wooden ranch house stood alone against the storm, creaking as if it remembered every winter that had ever passed. Inside, Ethan Cole sat silently by the fire. The flicker of flames danced over his weathered face. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with deep lines around his eyes. Years of sun, wind, and loneliness had carved him into something hard. He had lived on this ranch for 22 years, and for the last 4 he had lived completely alone. Once this house had been filled with laughter. Once there had been a woman who sang while cooking stew, and a little boy who loved to chase chickens through the snow. But fate had stolen them both during one cruel winter, a car crash on an icy road 1 county away. Since then, Ethan had stopped talking much, stopped smiling. He worked the ranch out of habit, not hope. He hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks. Tonight, as the storm shrieked outside, he sat listening to the fire crackle, lost in old memories, when something broke through the wind, a sound at first. He thought he imagined it, a faint cry buried inside the screaming blizzard. He held his breath and listened. There it was again, high-pitched, desperate, almost a whimper. He stood slowly, pulled on his thick coat. The sound didn't belong to the wind. It was alive. Ethan grabbed his lantern, opened the door, and was instantly swallowed by cold. Snow tore at his face. He pushed into the white void, his boots sinking deep, the light of the lantern barely reaching past his feet. The sound came again, closer this time. A thin cry, multiple cries. He followed it around the side of the barn, nearly blinded by the snow. The wind screamed, but underneath it he could hear them clearly now. Tiny cries, sharp, helpless. Then he saw them. 8 small shapes huddled together at the base of the barn wall. At first they looked like a pile of rags, but then one moved, lifting a trembling head. Its eyes flashed briefly in the lantern light. They were wolf cubs, 8 of them, tiny, no more than a few weeks old. Their fur was crusted with snow. Their bodies shook violently. One let out a weak squeak, then collapsed back into the pile. Ethan just stood there, frozen. Wild wolves were rare in these parts, and he had never seen pups this young alone. Where was their mother? Where was the pack? How had they survived this long in the storm? Lightning cracked somewhere far off, and the sky boomed like a drum. The wind roared so hard it nearly knocked him to his knees. The pups whimpered louder, curling into one another for warmth. Something deep inside Ethan stirred, something he thought had died long ago. He saw not wolves, but small helpless lives. Lives about to be erased by the cold. He knew what the wild rules said: never interfere. Let nature be nature. That was how he had lived for years. But tonight he couldn't, not this time. All right. Gwyn, he muttered into the wind. He stripped off his outer coat, dropped to his knees, and scooped them up one by one into his arms. Tiny cold bodies, lighter than a handful of feathers. They didn't even resist. They were too weak. He tucked them inside his coat against his chest where they could feel the heat of his body. Their icy paws pressed against his ribs. Their shivering slowed just a little. Then he stood and pushed back through the white chaos, clutching them as if carrying the last sparks of life in the world. By the time he kicked the door shut behind him, his beard was white with frost. He set the lantern down, tore off his wet gloves, and gently laid the cubs near the fireplace on an old wool blanket. They looked even smaller in the light. Thin legs, big heads, fur stuck together in frozen clumps. They were almost silent now. Just faint trembling, faint squeaks. Ethan hurried to the kitchen, filled a bowl with warm water, and soaked rags to wipe the ice from their fur. He worked quietly, gently. Something soft passed through his eyes that hadn't been there in years. One of the cubs let out a weak, squeaky sneeze, and for the first time in 4 years, Ethan Cole actually smiled. He didn't know if they would survive the night, but he knew he would try. As the storm howled outside, Ethan sat on the floor beside 8 abandoned wolf cubs, whispering to them like they were long-lost children. And for the first time in a very long time, the house did not feel empty. Ethan hardly slept that night. He stayed on the floor near the fire, feeding the cubs with an eyedropper he had once used for orphaned calves. One by one they licked at the warm milk, their tiny pink tongues barely touching the drops. Some were too weak to even lift their heads, and he had to coax the milk gently into their mouths. By dawn, the blizzard had passed. The land outside was buried in deep, blinding white. The world looked new, untouched, silent. Inside, life stirred. The cubs were curled in a tight circle on the wool blanket, their little bellies rising and falling with shallow breaths. Their fur was fluffy and dry now. They looked peaceful, as if they had always belonged there. Ethan stared at them for a long time, his coffee going cold in his hand. He had planned to drive into town that morning for feed supplies. Now he didn't dare leave them alone. They were fragile. A wrong chill, a missed feeding, and they would be gone, so he stayed. He built a pen from old wooden crates and lined it with hay. He filled hot water bottles to keep them warm. He even dug through a dusty trunk in the attic to find his late son's tiny baby blankets. The smell of old memories hit him like a wave, and for a moment he had to sit down, clutching the fabric to his chest. He had thought nothing could break through the stone wall around his heart, but these 8 small creatures had. He returned to them and tucked the blankets around their tiny bodies. They let out soft whimpers and snuggled closer to the warmth. Hours passed. He fed them again. They were stronger this time, greedier. One even nipped his finger with a soft, toothless bite. He laughed out loud, a rusty sound he hardly recognized as his own voice. As evening fell, something unexpected happened. While Ethan chopped wood outside, he heard a sharp yelp from the house. He ran inside, heart pounding. The cubs were scrambling awkwardly around their pen, bumping into each other on unsteady legs. One had escaped and was waddling across the floor, tail wiggling like a tiny flag. They were playing. They were alive. Something in Ethan's chest cracked wide open. He knelt and scooped up the runaway cub, holding it against his chest. It licked his chin with a rough little tongue. He whispered, "You little wild thing," and for just a moment, he felt like he wasn't alone anymore. That night, as he sat beside the fire with all 8 cubs piled on his lap like living warmth, Ethan felt something stir inside him that he had buried for years, hope. But outside, beyond the silent snowfields, glowing eyes watched from the tree line. Something was searching, something was coming. The night outside was like black glass. The storm had passed, leaving a cruel silence that pressed against the windows. The snow glowed faintly under the moon, untouched, smooth as bone. Ethan sat near the fire, half asleep in his chair, when a sound woke him, a sharp bark echoing faintly from the woods. He froze, every muscle tightening. His eyes flicked to the pen by the fireplace. The wolf cubs were asleep in a tangled heap, their tiny paws twitching as they dreamed. They hadn't stirred. There it was again, closer. A long, low howl that carried across the white fields like a ghost. It made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Ethan slowly stood, slipping on his boots and coat. He stepped out onto the porch, the wood groaning under his weight. The cold hit him like a blade. He stood completely still, listening. At first, he saw only white and shadow. Then movement. A dark shape at the tree line, low to the ground, gliding between the pines. Wolves. His chest tightened. They were watching. They had found the ranch. His first thought was brutal and instinctive, protect the cubs. He knew what wolves could do. He had seen what they could do to livestock. A pack could tear down a full-grown steer in minutes. And yet, these wolves weren't attacking. They were only watching. A soft whimper came from inside. One of the cubs had woken. It gave a thin, lost cry as if calling into the night. The dark shape in the woods lifted its head sharply. Ethan's breath caught. Could it be the mother? His mind spun. The cubs had been half dead when he found them. What kind of mother leaves her young in a blizzard? Or maybe she hadn't left. Maybe she had gone searching for food. Maybe something had gone wrong. Maybe she had been hunting while they froze, and now she had found them again. The cry came again from the pen. This time it wasn't alone. Another cub joined in, then another, their voices small but urgent. And from the tree line, the shadowed wolf let out a long, rising howl, a sound so raw and aching it pierced through Ethan like a blade of ice. It wasn't the cry of a hunter. It was the cry of a mother. Ethan gripped the porch railing hard. He felt like the world had tilted. Those cubs in his house, he had started to think of them as his. He had fed them, warmed them, watched them fight for life. They were safe here. They were alive because of him, and yet they were not his. He stayed outside until the figure in the woods finally melted back into the darkness. The night swallowed her whole. Only silence remained. Inside, the cubs had fallen quiet again, curled together like a living heartbeat. Ethan closed the door, leaned his back against it, and stared at the ceiling. He knew what he had to do, but the thought of it hollowed him out. He had promised himself he would never love again, not after losing his wife and son, and yet somehow, in just 2 days, these 8 wild lives had cracked open the sealed door of his heart. The idea of giving them back to the wilderness, of letting them vanish into the snow, was like imagining his house going cold and silent again. But they weren't his to keep. They belonged to the wild, and somewhere out there a mother was searching, calling, waiting in the freezing dark. Ethan hardly slept. He lay on the floor beside their pen, one hand inside, feeling their tiny warm bodies breathing under his fingers. They were alive because of him. But to truly live, they couldn't stay. He stared into the dying fire and whispered, "If she comes back, I'll give you to her, I swear." But a sharp pang struck through his chest, because even as he said it, he didn't know if he could keep that promise. Dawn came pale and slow, painting the white fields gold. The ranch stood still as a painting, smoke curling gently from the chimney. Inside, the cubs exploded with life. They were no longer silent bundles of fur. They tumbled over each other in the pen, biting tails, wrestling, letting out tiny growls like squeaky toys. One dragged a piece of blanket across the floor with fierce determination. Another clambered out of the pen entirely and waddled proudly toward Ethan, its stubby tail bouncing. Ethan caught himself laughing out loud as it climbed into his lap. He rubbed its warm fur, and it licked his thumb with a rough little tongue. His heart clenched painfully. He had spent the whole night thinking of the mother wolf. She was probably still out there, hungry and desperate. But another thought haunted him. What if she was gone? What if she had starved or been shot by hunters? What if the cubs were truly orphans now? If he released them and she never came? They would die, but if he kept them, they would never know the wild. They would grow up tame, trapped between worlds belonging to neither. He fed them carefully again, one by one. They drank greedily now, eyes bright. They were growing stronger. Every hour with them made the decision harder. As the sun rose higher, he made up his mind. He would try to find her. He bundled the cubs together in a crate lined with warm blankets, placed it on the sled behind his snowmobile, and set off toward the tree line where he had seen her. The engine roared through the stillness, sending up trails of glittering snow. The cubs whimpered softly, their heads poking from the blanket like curious flowers. He stopped at the forest's edge, cut the engine, and listened. Silence. The world here was untouched, wild. Tall black pines rose like spires. The snow lay smooth and perfect, except for a single set of paw prints, large, deep. Circling near the trees, Ethan knelt and touched one. Fresh. She had been here. He carried the crate into the trees and set it down gently. The cubs whined, confused, their tiny noses twitching at the smell of the wild. He stood back and waited. Minutes passed. Only wind, then movement. A shadow slipped silently between the trees. Then another. And another. Eyes glowed in the dim light, low to the ground. Wolves, 3 of them. Silent as mist, and then she stepped out. The mother. She was magnificent, tall and lean, her coat thick silver gray, her eyes burning amber. Her ribs showed faintly beneath her fur, but she moved like liquid steel. Her gaze locked on the crate instantly. The cubs squealed, recognizing her scent even through fear and time. They tumbled over each other, trying to reach her. Ethan's breath caught. This was her. Their mother. She had survived the storm. The other wolves flanked her, silent, waiting. The mother stepped closer. She sniffed the air, her ears twitching, her gaze flicking to Ethan and back to the cubs. One tiny cub scrambled out of the crate and stumbled through the snow toward her. It squeaked weakly, and something astonishing happened. The fierce wild wolf, the huntress, the survivor, let out a low whine and lowered her head. She touched her nose gently to the cub's head, then began licking its fur in quick, frantic strokes. Another cub followed, then another, until all 8 were crawling toward her on shaking legs, crying in high, sharp voices. She circled them, licking, nudging, her tail wagging like a silver flag. The other wolves stayed back, their eyes shining. A deep, wild song rose in the air, a soft chorus of howls, not of hunting, but of reunion. Ethan's vision blurred. He wiped his eyes roughly on his sleeve. He had never seen anything so raw, so full of life. He wanted to step forward, to touch her, to say something, but he stayed still. This was their world now, not his. The mother turned her blazing eyes on him. For a moment they stared at each other across the snow, man and wolf, both carved by loss, both scarred by loneliness. Then she gave a single sharp bark, and the pack melted into the trees like smoke, the cubs stumbling along behind her, squealing with joy. In seconds they were gone. Only paw prints remained, already fading under drifting snow. Ethan stood alone in the silent forest. His chest felt like a hollow cave. The sled was empty. His house would be quiet again. He had saved them and lost them. But as he turned back toward the ranch, something unexpected stirred inside him. It wasn't sadness, it was peace. He had given them back to where they belonged. He had done something good, something alive, something that mattered. As he drove back across the white fields, the cold wind biting his face, Ethan Cole felt something he hadn't felt in years. Pride. And far behind him, deep in the forest, a silver wolf lifted her head to the sky and howled, a wild, echoing song that carried all the way to the edge of the world. The days after Ethan returned from the forest felt hollow. The ranch was quiet again, too quiet. The sound of tiny paws, the squeaky growls, the rustling of blankets, all of it was gone. The fire crackled softly in the evenings, but there were no soft piles of fur curled near it now. No tiny noses pressing against his palms. It was as if the house had gone back to sleep. At first, Ethan told himself this was how things were meant to be. He had done the right thing. He had given them back to their world. He had restored nature's balance, but that didn't stop the silence from gnawing at him. Each morning he went through his old routine, feeding the horses, checking the fences, clearing the paths. And every time, without meaning to, he caught himself glancing toward the barn corner where he had first found them. Just a patch of snow now, cold and empty. He stopped talking to himself again, stopped smiling, and the nights were the worst. He would sit by the fire, staring into the flames until his vision blurred, and he could almost see them, the cubs tumbling over each other, yipping with joy. He would hear their faint squeaks echoing in the back of his mind. He could almost feel their warm weight on his lap, their tiny hearts beating fast against his ribs. Then the memory would fade, leaving only the hiss of burning wood and the soft groan of the old house shifting in the wind. Ethan had thought he wanted peace, solitude. He had told himself for years that he preferred being alone, that he didn't want anyone, anything to need him ever again. Because when things needed you, when you loved them, losing them broke you. But those 8 cubs had slipped past his defenses like sunlight through cracks. They had burned through the cold walls around his heart. And now that they were gone, the emptiness was unbearable. 3 nights after their return to the wild, Ethan dreamed of his son. In the dream, he was small again, no more than 5. He was running across the snow with a laugh like silver bells, calling, "Daddy, Daddy, look!" And in his tiny mittened hands, he was holding a fuzzy gray cub, eyes bright as the sun. Ethan had reached out to take it, and then he woke to the sound of real howling outside. He bolted upright. The fire was down to glowing embers. The world outside was black and frozen. The howls rose again, high wild, echoing across the valley. His heart pounded. Wolves. He stood, crossed the cold floor, and opened the door. Moonlight washed the snowfields in silver. The trees stood like dark soldiers in the distance. And there, just at the edge of the tree line, 8 small shapes danced in the snow, circling each other, pouncing, their tails whipping like little flags. Ethan's mouth fell open. The cubs. They were alive. All of them. They were taller now, leaner, their legs stronger, their fur thick and shining. They bounded through the snow like spirits, snapping playfully at each other, letting out yips that floated on the cold air. And then, one stopped. It turned. Its bright amber eyes locked on him. The others followed, freezing mid-play. 8 pairs of glowing eyes stared across the white distance. For a long moment, the world held its breath. Then one of them, he thought it might be the smallest, took a slow, careful step forward. Ethan's heart nearly stopped. Another followed. Then another. The whole group began padding silently toward him across the snow, their paws barely whispering against the crusted surface. Not running. Not stalking, just approaching. He couldn't move. His hands trembled at his sides. His throat ached. They stopped about 20 feet from the porch. The smallest one, its ears still too big for its head, let out a soft, "Hi, yip." Something inside Ethan shattered. He dropped to his knees in the snow, and then, like a sudden breaking wave, they rushed forward, bounding, yipping, leaping through the drifts. They hit him all at once, a tangle of fur and snow and joy. They circled him, nuzzled him, pressed cold noses into his hands, climbed over his shoulders. They licked his chin, his cheeks, their tails beating wildly. He laughed, a wild, broken sound that tore out of his chest like it had been trapped there for years. He laughed until he was shaking, until his face was wet with tears and their fur, and his hands were tangled in one joyous blur. They hadn't forgotten him, they had come back. The moon poured down like liquid silver as the cubs tumbled around him in the snow, their cries echoing across the silent plains. And for the first time in years, Ethan Cole didn't feel like a ghost. He felt alive. But deep in the forest, far beyond their laughter, glowing eyes watched. Not the mother, something else, something darker. The cubs stayed near the ranch for days. They came at night, like shy spirits. Sometimes Ethan woke to faint paw prints on the porch. Sometimes he found scraps of bone or feathers near the barn, gifts perhaps from their hunts. He stopped locking the door, stopped sleeping through the night. He would sit wrapped in a blanket by the fire with the door cracked open, listening, and slowly they grew bolder. One evening, just as the sun was bleeding behind the hills, Ethan looked up from chopping wood and saw them sitting in the field like sentinels. 8 young wolves, silent and proud. They were bigger now, nearly up to his thigh. Their bodies sleek with muscle, their eyes fierce. Yet when he stepped forward, they wagged their tails like excited dogs. He knelt in the snow, and they came to him without fear. He fed them scraps of meat. They ate eagerly, but with surprising gentleness, taking each piece from his hand without snapping. When they finished, they circled him, nuzzling, rubbing their heads against his shoulders. They were wild, yes, but not wild to him. Not anymore. And every time they appeared, Ethan felt the cold inside him melt a little more. The neighbors would have called him crazy. Wolves were dangerous, unpredictable, but they didn't know these wolves. They didn't know how they looked at him, not with hunger, but with recognition. Like they remembered he had carried them out of the blizzard, warmed them with his own body when the world was trying to erase them. He had saved their lives, and somehow they had saved his. But then the first warning came. It was a Tuesday just before dawn. Ethan was saddling his mare for the morning check on the fences when he saw it. Tracks near the chicken coop. Big tracks. Too big. He crouched, heart tightening. They weren't wolf prints, they were bear fresh. They circled the coop, then wandered toward the barn before veering off into the trees. Ethan followed them a short way, shotgun in hand, until they vanished into the woods. He felt a chill crawl down his spine, not from the cold. Bears rarely came this close to the ranch, not in winter, and not this big. He tried to brush it off. One wandering bear. No reason to panic, but that night the wolves didn't come, and the silence was heavier than the snow. The next evening they appeared again, but something was different. They were restless, pacing, ears twitching. Their play was frantic, nervous. They kept glancing toward the dark tree line, their noses lifting to the wind. Ethan watched them from the porch, uneasy. Then a deep, distant roar rolled across the fields like thunder. The cubs froze. Every hair on Ethan's neck stood up. The sound came again, closer this time. A savage, chest-shaking bellow that echoed from the woods. The cubs scattered like leaves, vanishing into the darkness. Ethan stood rooted to the porch, heart hammering. The world suddenly colder than the snow around him. Something enormous was moving out there, something hungry, and it had caught the scent of his wolves. That night, Ethan sat awake with his shotgun across his knees, staring into the black trees. The house felt like a lone island in an ocean of ice. Every creak of the wood, every groan of the wind made his finger tighten on the trigger. Far off in the distance, something howled. Low, broken, not a wolf's song, but something deeper, heavier. The wolves had brought life back to his world. But now, they had also brought danger. Ethan knew the wild had its own rules, and it was about to test him. The next days were soaked in tension. The cubs came less often now. When they did appear, they came silently, slipping like grey ghosts across the snow. Their playful yips were gone. They moved low to the ground, ears flicking, noses always lifted to the wind. They were afraid, and Ethan knew why. The bear was out there. The tracks had come closer each night, huge round prints pressed deep into the snow. They were as wide as dinner plates, heavy enough to crack the frozen crust. He found claw marks on one of the old fence posts. So high up he had to reach above his head to touch them. The wood was shredded, a grizzly, he realized. A big one, maybe the biggest he'd ever seen, and it wasn't passing through. It was staying. Each night, as the world fell silent, Ethan would sit by the window with the lamp turned off, watching the black line of trees. Sometimes he saw it, a massive shadow gliding between the trunks, silent and unstoppable. Sometimes he only heard it, the slow, deep crunch of its paws in the snow, the heavy breathing of something built for destruction. Once he woke to the sound of the horses screaming in the barn. He ran barefoot through the snow with his shotgun, heart slamming against his ribs. The bear was already gone, but the barn wall was splintered where it had slammed its weight against the door. It hadn't gotten in, but it would try again, and if the wolves were nearby when it did, they wouldn't stand a chance, not yet. They were growing, yes, taller, stronger, but they were still young, still small. Against a full-grown grizzly, they would be crushed like leaves. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about it. He had tried not to care, tried to tell himself the cubs were wild and not his responsibility. But it was too late. He had carried them in his coat when they were near death. He had watched them open their eyes, take their first real steps. They weren't just wild animals to him. They were his family, and something out there wanted to kill them. By the fourth night, the bear came even closer. Ethan found its prints circling the house itself. He followed them a short way and found a patch of snow soaked dark with blood, a deer half-eaten, torn apart with terrifying strength. The smell of it carried on the cold air, thick and metallic. That night the wolves returned, but not to play. They came silently, their paws making no sound on the snow. They gathered in the field, their bodies low, tails stiff, moving in eerie unison. They kept their distance from the house, eyes glowing like small lanterns in the moonlight. They were tense, nervous, sniffing the wind constantly. They didn't come near the porch. They didn't let him touch them. Ethan stood silently watching from the steps, his heart aching. Then suddenly they froze. All 8 of them, ears snapping forward at once. The forest behind them moved. Low growl rolled across the field like distant thunder, and then he saw it, the bear. It emerged from the trees like something pulled from an old nightmare, massive, shaggy, shoulders hunched, its fur crusted with snow and old scars. Its breath smoked in the freezing air. Its eyes caught the moonlight, small and burning. It was easily 3 times the size of the wolves. The cubs went rigid. One whimpered softly. The bear stepped into the open field. It wasn't charging. It wasn't even rushing. It was walking slowly, confidently, like it owned the earth under its feet. Ethan's body moved before his mind caught up. He ran to the barn, grabbed the shotgun and a flare, and came back onto the porch yelling, "Hey, get out of here!" His voice cracked the silence like a whip. He fired into the air. The boom echoed off the hills. The bear stopped, lifted its huge head, stared at him with cold, unblinking eyes. Then it turned, slowly, lazily, and melted back into the black trees, as if it had all the time in the world. The wolves scattered instantly, vanishing like smoke, and then the field was empty. Ethan stood shaking on the porch, the shotgun slipping in his sweaty hands. His breath burst in white clouds. The silence returned, but it was heavier now, thicker, pressing on him from all sides. The bear wasn't afraid of him, not even a little, and next time, it wouldn't walk away. Ethan sat awake all night, staring into the fire, his mind spinning. He could call the county ranger, report the animal, but they would kill it. That's how they handled predators. Traps, poison, bullets, and killing wasn't what he wanted. What he wanted was to protect the wolves, but if the bear found them first, there would be nothing left to protect. By dawn, he had made his decision. He was going to fight for them, even if it killed him. The morning air was sharp and bitter, the kind that bit the inside of your nose. The ranch lay silent under a hard blue sky, snow glittering like crushed glass. Ethan moved through the yard like a man on a mission. He reinforced the barn doors with thick planks. He dragged old metal gates from storage to build a wall around the chicken coop. He fixed the latch on the grain shed. He checked the fuel in the snowmobile, loaded the sled with emergency supplies and stacked boxes of ammo by the door. And then he set traps, not to kill, just to warn. Old tin cans strung on wire across the tree line. Motion lights nailed to fence posts. Anything that might give him a second of warning if the bear came out of the dark. By the time the sun dipped low, his body ached. His hands were cracked and raw. But the ranch was ready, or as ready as it could be. As darkness fell, he brought the horses inside and bolted the barn tight. Then he sat on the porch with his shotgun wrapped in a blanket, eyes fixed on the tree line, and he waited. The world went black. The stars came out cold and sharp as nails. The wind howled across the empty fields. The house behind him glowed faintly through its frosted windows. He almost didn't see them at first. 8 small shadows slipping across the snow, silent, graceful. The wolves. They came straight to him this time, heads low, tails wagging slowly. He crouched and they swarmed around him, brushing against his legs, pressing their cold noses into his hands. They were bigger now, up to his waist. Their eyes shone like coins in the moonlight. "You shouldn't be here tonight," he whispered, voice hoarse. "It's not safe." They didn't understand. Or maybe they did. One sat and stared at him steadily, as if it could feel the storm of fear rolling off his heart. And then, the night broke. A sound like the earth itself tearing open roared from the forest. Trees cracked. Branches snapped. The ground trembled under Ethan's boots. The bear. The wolves spun as one, ears flat, fur bristling. A low growl rippled through them like a wave, and then it stepped out of the black, even bigger than before, a mountain of muscle and fur. It lumbered into the field on paws the size of dinner plates, its breath exploding from its jaws in white gusts. Its eyes burned. The wolves lowered themselves to the snow, snarling softly. Their tails lashed. Ethan raised the shotgun. The bear roared, a sound so loud it shattered the night. Birds exploded from the trees. The horses screamed in the barn. Ethan fired into the air. The blast cracked across the valley. The bear didn't even flinch. It came forward, slow, deliberate. Each step shook the ground. "Go!" Ethan shouted at the wolves. "Run! Go!" But they didn't move. They formed a line in front of him. 8 gray bodies, shoulder to shoulder, hackles up, teeth bared. Their growls rose like a single living thing. They were still young, still small compared to the monster bearing down on them, but they were not. Running, they were defending him. Ethan's heart twisted so hard it hurt to breathe. He stepped forward beside them. The bear thundered closer, snow spraying under its paws, jaws open in a roar that ripped the sky in half. Ethan braced, finger on the trigger, ready to fire straight at its chest, and the wolves moved. They shot forward as one, silent gray streaks. They didn't attack head-on. They split like water around a rock, flashing teeth and claws. One darted at its hind legs, another snapped at its face, another raked its flank and vanished. The bear bellowed, rearing on its hind legs, swiping massive paws that could kill with a single blow, but they were too fast. Too many. They were a storm of motion, slashing, biting, darting in and out. Their howls rose wild and fierce, echoing through the freezing night. Ethan stood frozen, staring, heart hammering. They were risking their lives. For him, the bear spun, snapping, roaring, but the wolves danced away. They drove it backward, step by step, out of the field, back toward the trees. It swung a paw and sent one spinning across the snow, but it leapt back up, limping but alive, diving in again. And then something changed. The bear stopped. It stood, chest heaving, blood dripping from its muzzle. It looked at the wolves circling it, the man with the gun behind them, the bright fire in their eyes, and it turned. It lumbered into the black forest, crashing through the trees, roaring one last time before the night swallowed it whole. Silence slammed down. The wolves stood panting, sides heaving, steam rising from their bodies. One limped, another's shoulder was bloody, but they were alive. Every one of them. They turned to Ethan, eyes glowing, tails slowly wagging. He dropped to his knees in the snow, the shotgun falling from his hands. They had chosen him, and together they had faced the wild. The storm passed, but the night it left behind was eerily still. Snow lay unbroken across the field, pale as bone in the moonlight. The trees stood frozen, their branches glittering like glass. Not a single breath of wind stirred the air. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, and Ethan was holding his. The wolves were scattered around the yard, still panting from the fight. Their fur was matted with blood and snow. Steam curled from their bodies into the cold. They stood in a loose circle, watching the black line of the forest where the bear had disappeared. Ears flicking, noses twitching, eyes burning like coins. Ethan moved slowly, afraid that if he blinked they might vanish. He went first to the smallest one, the pale grey cub that had been thrown across the snow by the bear's paw. It limped toward him, tail wagging weakly, and pressed its muzzle into his hand. He felt the tremble of pain in its body. Blood streaked its shoulder, but the wound was shallow. The others padded close, forming a silent ring around him. Their breath rose like smoke in the moonlight. Something deep inside Ethan cracked wide open. For so long, this ranch had been silent. After his wife died, he had filled the days with noise, fixing fences, mending roofs, chopping wood, just to drown out the emptiness. But every night when the work was done and the fire burned low, the silence would creep back in, cold and heavy, settling over him like snow. And now here they were. 8 wild hearts beating like drums in the night, 8 pairs of glowing eyes watching him, as if he were the only soul on earth. They had risked everything for him, and they were still standing. Something like pride rose in his chest, hot and fierce. "You're warriors," he whispered, voice breaking. "All of you." They didn't understand the words, but they understood his voice. One by one they pressed against him, their fur warm and rough under his hands. They licked his face, whining softly. He laughed through tears, wrapping his arms around them, burying his face in their fur. For a long time, they stayed like that, man and wolves tangled together in the snow, the moonlight wrapping them in silver silence. But as dawn began to creep over the hills, something changed. The wolves grew restless, one by one. They stood and stretched, shaking the frost from their coats. Their ears turned toward the forest, their eyes lit with a wild light he had seen before. The call of the deep woods, older than words, older than memory. It pulled at them like a tide. Ethan's heart sank. He knew what this meant. They had survived the bear. They had grown strong. The wild was calling them home, and he could not follow. The realization sliced through him like a blade. He had saved them, raised them, loved them, but they didn't belong to him. They belonged to the wind, the trees, the silent white mountains. He was just the quiet harbor where they had healed their wings. They were ready to fly now. He stood slowly, hands trembling. The wolves gathered at the edge of the field. They turned their heads to look at him, 8 pairs of eyes glowing like stars. They didn't howl. They didn't cry. They just looked long and steady, as if trying to burn his face into their memory. And then they turned and they ran. Silent shadows streaking across the snow, slipping between the trees until they were swallowed by the forest and gone. Just gone. Ethan stood alone in the empty field, his breath a ghost in the cold air. The silence roared in his ears. The world felt hollow, and then he fell to his knees and wept. Spring came like a dream. The snow melted, peeling back from the earth in slow gray sheets. Rivers cracked open and roared to life. The fields turned green, soft and trembling in the wind. Wildflowers speckled the hills like spilled paint, and Ethan was alone. The ranch was clean, bright, alive again. He had mended every fence, scrubbed every stall, painted the barn door red. He worked from sunup to sundown, but at night, when the wind died and the frogs began to sing, the silence returned. He missed them more than he thought he could bear. Sometimes he caught himself setting out scraps of meat on the porch. Sometimes he thought he heard their paws on the roof, or saw their shapes slipping through the trees. Sometimes, when the moon was high, he thought he could feel them lying beside him like before, their warmth, their breathing, the slow, steady beat of their wild hearts. But they never came, and then one night they did. It was late. The moon was full and round as a silver coin, pouring light over the fields. Ethan sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, staring into the dark trees, lost in old memories. A shape moved at the edge of the forest. Then another, and another. 8 of them. He blinked, heart stopping in his chest. They came out of the trees like ghosts, taller now, their bodies powerful and lean, their fur thick and shining. Their eyes glowed with wild fire. They were magnificent. They were wild. They were home. And yet, they had come back. They padded silently across the field and stopped at the porch. The biggest one stepped forward and dropped something at his feet. Ethan bent down with shaking hands. It was a bleached deer skull, clean and perfect. The antlers wide like a crown. A gift. He understood what it meant. They had survived. They had hunted. They had become a true pack. And they were showing him. They were saying, "We made it. Because of you." Tears burned his eyes. The wolves circled him, pressing their massive heads into his hands. Their fur smelled of pine and wild wind. They stayed for a long time under the silver moon, no longer pups, no longer lost. They were whole, and they had come back, just to say goodbye. As the moon climbed higher, they turned as one, heads lifting. A sound rose from their throats, soft at first, then swelling until it filled the night. A howl. 8 voices weaving together, wild and haunting, echoing through the hills like a song older than time. Ethan stood with his hand over his heart, tears streaking his face, listening as their voices shook the stars. And then they were gone. They slipped into the dark trees, silent as shadows. He watched until they vanished, until the forest swallowed them completely. And this time, there was no sadness, because they weren't leaving him. They were becoming who they were always meant to be. The silence returned to the ranch, soft and gentle now, no longer cold. He stood alone under the silver moon, smiling through tears, the deer skull cradled in his arms like a treasure, and somewhere, far away, the wolves howled again. They would always be his family, even if he never saw them again. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another incredible story like this. Your support helps us bring you more heart-melting tales of courage, love, and the wild. If you had to say goodbye to an animal you raised and loved, would you let them go back to the wild or keep them by your side forever? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one.